Please join me in virtually welcoming Adam Hanieh to UW.
I want to begin just by thanking very much Yvette and Dr. Jung for organizing this event. I would love to have been there in person, but I'm excited to be part of this program. It looks like an excellent and very invigorating day. You will notice with my slides that I have actually taken the liberty of changing the title slightly, given the events of the current few days. So my title will be From Palestine to Iran, toward a global history of fossil capitalism and anti-colonial imaginaries. I will still speak to the question of Iraq as well, but given the pressing matters of the recent days, I wanted to focus a little bit more on Iran's place in this bigger story. I want to just at the beginning, before getting into my presentation, make three overarching points that I will come back to throughout this lecture today. The first is that what I am aiming to do is to describe the linkages and mutual relationship between two transitions that occurred in the middle of the 20th century. The first of these transitions is the transition from coal to oil as the leading or principal fossil fuel. And I'll speak to this in a couple of slides. The second transition is the rise and emergence of the United States as the dominant power, particularly in the wake of World War II through the second half of the 20th century. Now, often we think of these transitions as distinct or separate. What I would like to argue today is that we need to think of this question of energy transition and question of the change in global power and the change in the world system as being deeply interlinked and mutually constitutive. So that's the first argument I want to make throughout. The second point is to link these transitions, these two transitions I spoke to the question of colonialism and neo-colonial structures, and of course anti-colonial movements and struggles that emerged through the 20th century, and ask, how does thinking about these twin transitions that I've described complicate our understandings of colonialism and resistance to colonialism at a global level? And the third point is, I think, reflected in the title of the workshop and conference today, and that is, of course, to think about how these questions reverberate in the present, both in terms of war and conflict, but also, of course, the climate emergency. So those are the three kind of overarching themes that I want to speak to today. Before getting into these questions of transition and energy, I just want to make some general points around the issue of oil and thinking about oil. Because as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, there's a lot that's been written on oil, the history of oil, more generally, its connection to the climate and the climate emergency. And as I will demonstrate in the next slide, this emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel really occurred in the middle of the 20th century. But I want to just highlight a couple of things that perhaps go against the way that we typically think about oil. The first of these is that we need to move away, I think, from a conception of framing oil simply as a liquid transport fuel, something that we just put in our automobiles, our cars, and rather think about the way that oil has come to permeate all aspects of our lives. One of the things I try to do in my book, Crude Capitalism, is to draw out, for instance, the question of plastics and petrochemicals, these fundamental substances that really surround us in our everyday lives. They surround us in the form of plastics, in the form of artificial fibers, such as the clothes that we are all wearing, in the form of synthetic rubbers, in the form of fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, These are all derivatives of oil. Yet we don't often think and consider oil in what is called these downstream states, what crude oil becomes as it's refined and processed into these other kinds of materials that really underpin all forms of commodity production today. Another aspect of oil that is often not thought about, I think, in enough depth is the question of oil's relationship to our financial system, in particular the emergence of the US dollar as the dominant global currency through the latter part of the 20th century. So I will continually emphasize as we move through today this question of thinking about oil as beyond just the petrol form, the liquid transport fuel. In doing so, we need to consider the whole of the oil value chain. And this means thinking about oil from its extraction as crude underground reserves, through refining, through its transport, the various infrastructures that connect, that move oil around the world, and of course, the marketing and sale to the final consumer. This entire value chain, thinking about this entire value chain, is really critical to understanding those points I outlined at the beginning, in particular, the relationship between these twin transitions of oil's emergence and the power of the United States within the world system. Related to this, again, some very important questions when we're thinking about oil is who controls the circulation of oil and the movement of oil around the world in terms of the various corporate structures and companies that dominate the industry today. And then another question that really is extremely significant, particularly when we're thinking about issues of anti-colonial movements, is the forms of labor that are involved in the extraction, production, and transport of oil. Too often, workers and workers' movements, labor movements are forgotten in this bigger question of oil. And again, I'm going to highlight some instances of that today. So let's move on and think about these histories in a bit more concrete forms. So firstly, this question of the energy transition. Now, you can see from this graph, it's a quite a stark graph, I think, that in the middle of the 20th century, around the time of World War II, and that timing is not an accident, as I'll explain in a second, we see the rapid rise of oil, which is the green color on the graph, the orange shade on the graph, really surpass coal as the leading fossil fuel, So the fossil fuels on this graph are, of course, coal in red, oil in orange, and yellow, natural gas in yellow. We can see here that around 1950, a moment that scientists talk about as the Great Acceleration, because it marks our deep and impact on the ecosystem biosphere that we are facing today. That moment of the 1950s is when oil really emerges as the leading fossil fuel. But it's also important to note here that this language of transition can be somewhat misleading. And this is very pertinent, of course, given much of the discussion around the so-called green transition today, in the sense that what we see from this graph very clearly is that oil's emergence and surpassing of coal didn't mean the end of coal as an energy source. And in fact, coal continued to increase. Last year was the world's largest production of coal, oil, and gas in history. So in this sense, the language of transition can be one that is misleading in the sense that it implies that one energy source is replaced by another. But in fact, what we can see very clearly from this graph is that these energy transitions are additive, not substitutive. We see oil added on top of this fossil fuel substrate, And I think we can argue today in the terms of renewable energy that we are seeing a similar process occur where renewables are added on top of a bigger fossil fuel substrate that includes coal, oil, and gas. And I'll come back to that question towards the end. So this is the moment of energy transitions around the time of the Second World War. Now, this coal to oil transition, it didn't occur at a single moment. It began in the early 20th century in the United States as the first kind of geography of oil's rise in a significant way. Oil was initially used for lighting in the form of kerosene and then gasoline with the widespread rollout of internal combustion engines, and of course with fuel oil, which is a type of oil product used in for heating and also for Navy and Navy ships, which was an important point. So, which I'll come back to. The United States was the center of this transition in the early 1900s, and at this moment, the vast bulk, around 70% of global production in the first couple of decades of the 20th century were located in the US as the center of the global oil industry. The leading firm was a firm that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a firm called Standard Oil, which was headed by John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil was a vertically integrated firm, and it was one of the first firms to seek to control all parts of the oil value chain, from the extraction of oil through its refining, its transport, and then sale to the final consumer. Now, despite the fact that the US was the center globally of oil consumption and production in these early decades of the 20th century, the US firms tended to lack a geographic base outside, or a crude oil base outside of the United States itself. If we look, for example, at Iran, Iranian oil production, which I'm going to speak to in some depth, was controlled by a firm called Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC. Indonesia, oil supplies in Indonesia were controlled by Royal Dutch Shell. And then another important geography of oil production post-1917 was, of course, the Soviet Union, where oil supplies were nationalized after the revolution and controlled at that moment by the Bolshevik government. So this was the kind of picture, if you like, of the global industry at this early stage. Now, there has been a very close link, of course, with war making and militarism, and the expansion of fossil capitalism. And World War I was a transformative moment in this. We can see that through war making, a range of new technologies start to be apparent in military technologies such as tanks and submarines, vehicles, and of course later aeroplanes, types of explosives that depend upon oil production. The graphic example here of the expansion of vehicles, motorized vehicles used by the British military throughout the war, I think is indicative of the way of this link between the expansion of fossil capitalism and militarism. Another important aspect to this that is often forgotten is the introduction of synthetic fertilizers and machinery into agriculture, which played an important role in the First and particularly the Second World War, with the releasing of labor for both factories and the waging of war itself. So again, emphasizing the point here that oil, thinking about oil, we need to consider it in this expansive way, not simply in the way of a liquid transport fuel. Today, of course, the military, the US military in particular, is the largest institutional emitter of CO2 emissions globally. So again, we can see, and those emissions will have been in the last week or so increasing dramatically with the war we are currently seeing in the Middle East. So I had said that the United States was not what was the center of world oil, but it lacked the access to crude reserves, oil reserves outside of the US territory itself. And we see here the first phase, if you like, through after 1918, after the First World War, the expansion of the American oil industry into Latin America as its first target. The quote you can read here on the screen from the US Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, I think is something that reverberates well today, particularly given the abduction of Maduro in Venezuela a few weeks ago, and the kind of language of we are the boss of the Western Hemisphere. We heard repeated by US Trump administration officials. Lansing said something similar in 1918. No oil properties in the neighborhood of the Panama Canal should be owned by other than Americans. So we see at this moment the beginnings of the expansion of the US oil industry into Colombia as an important target. We see the kinds of racialized conceptions of indigenous peoples and, of course, the wider peoples of Latin America throughout this colonial expansion. This quote you can see on the screen is taken from a US government report in the 1950s, where it said about the first concession in Colombia that firms had to carve their producing fields out of steaming jungles filled with wild animal life and infested with the most savage tribe of Indians extant in this hemisphere. So again, there's a close connection between these racialized tropes and the expansion of the industry more generally. Again, there was resistance to this project, obviously, and attempts by movements, social movements, labor movements, political movements to gain control of oil and other kinds of resources. Mexico stands out here following 1917. Where there was a declaration that these resources would be publicly owned, and eventually oil was nationalized in Mexico in 1938. But in much of the region, and including in Venezuela, what we see is a pattern of governance linking colonial administration with very profitable access to resources such as oil. So in the case of Venezuela, the general or the military ruler of Venezuela allowed American and other oil firms to drill for oil without having to pay taxes or royalties, and he used to sell the concessions to those oil firms as a means of supporting his regime, becoming in the process one of the richest men in Latin America with business interests in many different fields. Very importantly, and this I think is something I want to come back to later in the discussion around Iran, it is interesting to see the way that this colonial expansion of the oil industry in Latin America also started to develop around a conscious attempt by oil firms to disaggregate the oil value chain territorially, to separate the refining stage, from the territories where crude oil reserves were located. In the case of Venezuela, this took place through the major American firms locating their refineries in nearby Dutch-controlled Caribbean islands, Curaçao and Aruba, and using those refineries to process Venezuelan oil, which could then be shipped to the United States. And these refineries became the largest in the world quite quickly, despite the fact that those Caribbean islands lack any indigenous oil reserves. And in fact, up in as late as 1938, 1/4 of the world's refining capacity were located on these islands. This was a conscious strategy of oil firms, urged on actually by General Gomez, as a means to prevent labor in the refining sector attempting to engage in industrial action or take control of the industry itself. So this kind of disaggregation of the oil value chain is, I think, something interesting to think about, and it bears a lot of thinking in terms of understanding the industry today. Now, through World War I, moving to the question of the Middle East, we see in the Middle East a similar process of colonial expansion, particularly with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in the wake of the First World War. It's often forgotten, I think, that despite the fact World War I was a war between European powers, it was not a war that was confined to Europe itself. Around a quarter of the population living in the Ottoman Empire at the time perished throughout the war, with death rates actually twice that of France and Germany. With the end of the war and the victory of Britain and France in particular, the region itself was divided between British and French colonialism through a variety of different colonial arrangements, including mandate rule, as well as direct colonial control, Britain becoming the dominant power in the countries that you can see listed here, and France also gaining a foothold in Lebanon and Syria, in addition, of course, to the North African territories that France controlled. There was a close link here with the question of oil extraction, and in particular, as we'll see, Britain consciously thought about the Middle East through the lens of its oil interests in Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf monarchies. Now, in these territories, we see the replication of the patterns that I've described earlier in Venezuela, in the sense that the British put in place and supported various monarchical regimes. In some cases, such as the case of King Faisal I in Iraq, putting in place people who had no connection to that country. In the case of King Faisal, he had no connection to Iraq, but he was installed by the British as a ruler in 1921. Following the bloody suppression by the British Air Force of a mass nationwide anti-colonial revolt in the country. So this and in these countries where oil was present, we see the extraction of oil on very favorable concessions because of these kinds of colonial arrangements. In the case of Britain, there is an explicit connection here between this transition from coal to oil that I described earlier, in particular, the goal of the British Navy, then headed by Winston Churchill, to transition away from coal as the fuel of the British Navy towards oil or fuel oil fired ships, which could be refueled quicker, required less labor on the ships, and were more maneuverable. So at this moment, while Churchill is making the argument for why oil is important for Britain's war-making ability, he says very clearly in 1913 that Britain must become the owners or the controllers at the source of the oil which we require. And this must be under British control or British influence. So it's very clear here, I think, the ways in which the coal to oil transition is linked to the rise and the deepening of British colonial rule in the Middle East region. An important target of this is Iran, which was then essentially under British control. It wasn't a formal colony, but under British control. And it was here that the British government invested in a company called Anglo-Persian Oil Company that today we know as BP. It went through a number of name changes, and today we know that company is BP, which ran and controlled all of Iran's oil supplies and refining, and in return paid a small a small royalty to the Iranian monarchy, the Pahlavi monarchy, which is, of course, remains in the news today. And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. The question of oil in the Middle East, however, wasn't simply a question of access to oil as a commodity, as a physical commodity. What was very important here was also the ways in which the financial surpluses associated with oil continued to circulate through British financial markets, in particular the City of London. So the monarchs who were paid, the governments in Kuwait and elsewhere, Iraq, Iran, who earned royalties from giving access to British firms to oil, would place their wealth in British banks in the City of London. That oil would be sold in sterling. And in this way, we can see a link between the place and importance of the City of London in the global financial system and the emergence of oil as a leading fossil fuel, linked, of course, with British colonial power in the region. Now, in the wake and through the 1920s, we see this second transition that I spoke about beginning to take place in the sense of the United States rising and gaining more global influence, more global power, and the question of access to the resources of the Middle East becomes pertinent throughout this post-World War I moment, because at that moment, the British and the French essentially controlled the region, the Middle East as a whole, and they blocked the entrance of American firms into the oil reserves. This wasn't just limited to the Middle East, it was also the case in India as well as Nigeria, two countries that were then again under British colonies and colonial control. So there is a struggle here that begins to develop, where the US is calling for the open door, so-called open door policy, to be able to have access for US firms to these resources in the region. And there is a very interesting link here where we see the United States government utilize its extensive oil reserves in the United States as a means or as a lever to expand and open the door in the Middle East. So in 1920, the U.S. Mineral Leasing Act is passed by the U.S. government, then Woodrow Wilson, which basically says, as part of this Mineral Leasing Act, that no foreign company would be allowed to gain mineral rights on U.S. public land if their government denied the same rights to U.S. citizens in other parts of the world. And this was very clearly targeted in particular at Britain and the British government and their policies in the Middle East. So it was through this kind of back and fro, and it's connected with other diplomatic negotiations in the Middle East itself, that eventually the United States gains entry into an important firm, the Iraq Petroleum Company, in 1928. Which this company was a company that was owned by European firms, and in 1928, a consortium of American firms were also permitted to join. The Iraq Petroleum Company had rights to all of the oil in Iraq for the next 75 years. So that gives an indication of the kinds of concessionary agreements that were then were being given by individuals such as King Faisal I that I mentioned. There are 2 points that I just want to kind of emphasize here, bigger points. One is the link between the internal conditions of the US market and global control of oil. It was the importance of the US market and the relative decline of European colonial powers through the 1920s that allowed the US to open the door in the Middle East and elsewhere to these kinds of resources. But at that moment, once the door was opened, the US promptly shut the door once it was part of the club with access to those resources. But in doing so, the United States continued to rely on, particularly on British colonial structures, military and political structures, to facilitate these very advantageous concessions that were present in the Middle East region. The second point that's important to emphasize here is the importance of vertical integration and the control of the entire value chain, because what these firms, such as the Iraq Petroleum Company, did, they not only did they extract the crude oil from places like Iraq, they also controlled the refining and the shipping of oil globally once that had been extracted. So this is an important point in thinking about, again, the structure of the oil industry time. Now, this kind of vertical integration later emerged in the sense of a handful of companies, 7 companies that became known as the Seven Sisters, 5 American firms and 2 European firms. You can see them listed on the screen. These 7 sisters were massively powerful, vertically integrated firms. They controlled around 90% of all of the crude oil reserves outside of the US and Soviet Union through the 1930s and 1940s. They controlled about 80% of all refining capacity outside of the US and Soviet Union at that time. They controlled about 85% of the petrochemical industry, again, outside of the US and Soviet Union. Indicating their kind of vertically integrated structures, they owned at least half of the world's tanker fleets in 1949 and all of the world's pipelines, again, outside of the US and Soviet Union around this time. So these Western firms built their power through the ability to exclude competitors, to control the entire value chain, and through those colonial structures that I spoke to earlier. Now, of course, in the wake of World War II, which was just as much a war fueled by oil in the sense that it was run on these new oil-powered technologies, we, of course, had the anti-colonial upsurges and the weakening of British and French colonialism through the 1950s and 1960s. In the Middle East, we see this expressed through the emergence of individuals such as Gamal Abdel Nasser. You can see on the screen there, one of the leaders of the Arab, one of the leaders of important Arab nationalist leaders, as well as there were other forms of Arab nationalism, left-wing communist movements in the region, and very much expressing this question around the desire and the importance of bringing back control of the region's oil, taking it away from those Western firms, such as the Iraq Petroleum Company that I spoke about earlier. This is a moment where the bigger oil transition occurs in Western Europe, and it's important to note here that the Middle East is the key source of that oil that enables Western Europe to make that coal to oil transition. So again, when we're thinking about energy transitions in Western Europe, it cannot be thought separate from the colonial structures and resource extraction that exists and existed in places such as the Middle East. Now, if we are moving to the question of Iran, which is a really key focal point for these anti-colonial struggles, but also the kind of articulation between British colonialism and also an emerging American power in the region through the 1950s. At this moment, As I said, the Iranian oil was controlled by this British firm. It was initially APOC, then it became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, then British Petroleum, and now we know this firm as BP. This was a firm that controlled the extraction of oil, but most importantly, it also controlled the Abadan oil refinery in Iran, which was in the 1940s was the largest oil refinery in the world. This refinery had a concentration of oil workers from different nationalities, including Iranian, Arab, South Asian workers, as well as a layer of upper management who were Western and British of origin. It was also a site of key labor strikes in the history of Iran, including a massive strike in the refinery in 1941. So very much these struggles were part of how the language of nationalization emerged in Iran in the 1940s and 1950s, the increasing demands from the various political movements in Iran to nationalize that oil and kick out what became BP, the British Petroleum. A key moment of this was the rise to power of Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized oil in Iran in 1951. And it is interesting to note that this oil nationalization that took place under Mossadegh was reverberated in very powerful ways throughout the wider Middle East region. In fact, in Egypt, Mossadegh visited Egypt in the early 1950s. The nationalization was immensely popular in Egypt and inspired Nasser and other Egyptian political movements. And in 1952, we had the Egyptian Revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers in Egypt. So this is the cross-regional dynamics of the ways in which these movements inspired other parts of the region that did not necessarily have significant oil supplies. This is a critical point to make, that when we're thinking about the ways in which oil and other kinds of resource struggles are articulated, they are articulated regionally, not simply in the places where they happen to be present. Now, of course, what happened was a coup in 1953, a coup led by the United States and Britain, which basically ousted Mossadegh and restored the Pahlavi monarchy. This is the same Pahlavi monarchy, of course, that the United States is speaking about restoring again in Iran today. So this coup was significant for a number of reasons. It broke the back of this nationalization, but it also demonstrated the way that the United States was now playing a much more significant and substantial role in the politics of the region. And indeed, after the coup, US oil firms gained a foothold in Iran. Now, this was these kinds of struggles were wider than simply the Middle East. They reverberated throughout the whole of the world. In 1955, the Bandung conference that brought together 29 newly independent states, their final communique referred to oil and the importance of thinking about oil and the control of oil. These discussions between Venezuela in particular, but also states in the Middle East, led eventually in 1960 to the formation of OPEC, which and the eventual slow nationalization of oil, crude oil supplies in these areas. Now, it is important to note that this wasn't just about the control of crude reserves. It was also about the ability to control the price of oil that had at that moment been under the control of Western oil firms. So this was as much part of how the driving force behind the establishment of OPEC as the control of crude reserves itself. Now, through the 1950s and 1960s, we see a range of US-backed coups in various oil-rich states. Some of them listed here. Of course, this wasn't the limit to American military intervention globally, but these are significant resource oil-rich states where we see this taking place. We also see at this moment a very important political development in the Middle East region through the 1967 war, in which Israel defeats the key Arab militaries and really sets back movements such as those of Nasser and other Arab nationalist anti-colonial struggles in the region. And it is at this moment that the United States emerges as the key ally of Israel, as well as building very closely an alliance with the Saudi monarchy and the other Gulf monarchies. The United States basically provides these monarchies with political, military, and economic support, increasing economic linkages with those monarchies, in return for a guarantee that oil would not be used as a weapon against Western states, and that oil financial surpluses would flow into US financial markets. So it's at this moment that we see this link between petrodollar flows, the rise or the financial flows that arise from the sale of oil, and their deep imbrication with the American financial markets that exists today and is even more strong today. And I'm happy to speak about that in our discussion. So this kind of architecture of American power in the Middle East emerges in this post-1967 moment. On one side, an clear American alliance with Israel after 1967, and also with the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, through the 1970s. The question of Israel is important when we're discussing and considering the issues of colonialism, of course, because Israel, as a settler colony, was and continues to be, of course, a highly militarized and racialized state. And in that sense, it's a dependable ally of the United States in the region. We can compare it in many ways to the relationship between the South African apartheid regime and British and American imperialism in the African continent, all the way up to 1994. So what we have seen in recent years, and this is something that is extremely evident today, is an attempt by the United States to normalize relationships between the Gulf states and Israel. This was it's been a long-standing policy. It was deepened through the 1990s and the Oslo Accords, of course, with the 2020 Abraham Accords, and then a free trade agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel in 2022. It's an attempt by the United States to reassert its primacy in the region because of the region's importance, oil reserves, by bringing together these two main powers. Two main pillars of American interests and power in the region. So I'm going to end here. Just the final few points I wanted to make. Again, I'm happy to expand on these in discussion. Is the oil and gas, as I said in that first transition slide, remain absolutely central to global capitalism, linked, of course, with the climate emergency we're currently seeing. There's been significant changes beyond the scope of this lecture, of course, in the last few decades with the rise of national oil companies like Saudi Aramco and changing patterns of the world oil trade. Again, I'm happy to speak to this in discussion. But more broadly, I've tried to say tonight that we need to think about these colonial and anti-colonial struggles, their connections to global energy patterns, but also thinking about them beyond simply the borders, beyond simply within the borders of oil-rich states, to think about them more broadly throughout its regional ramifications, and to avoid flattening the social relations in these dominated countries, in places like Iran, where we do see significant labor struggles as connected to the rise of nationalist movements and the desire to nationalize oil in these states. But thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you have a question you would like to ask Adam, Hanieh, if you could step up to either of these mics, that would be great. So could I begin the Q&A with a question about anti-colonial struggles? I think you read about, you talked about the Bandung moment in the 1950s. I think there was a historical moment when anti-colonial struggles saw the nationalization of oil as an anti-colonial move, right? But then once that nationalization or potential nationalization happened, it got co-opted into what you call fossil capitalism, right? So it is a hopeful story, but it's also a very depressing story, right? So could you unpack that for us?
Certainly. Do you want me to answer that question directly, or?
Sure, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I think is very important when we're thinking about this moment of anti-colonial post-war movements, as well as the eventual nationalization of oil in places like Saudi Arabia in particular. Because, as I described, what happened after this nationalization in the Gulf states in particular is the attempt by the United States to build these alliances with the Gulf monarchies and to ensure their survival, political and military survival in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the other monarchies, initially also with the Iranian Pahlavi monarchy as well. As long as those countries recirculated their financial surpluses into the American market, Saudi Arabia insists in 1974 that OPEC will only price oil in US dollars, which is the important part of this story. So it's the incorporation of these states into the architecture of American empire that actually allows the oil trade to continue as it is, because remember, the downstream of this, of the industry, the refining, the transport, the marketing of oil remains completely in the hands of Western firms at this moment. And it remains so up until basically the early 2000s. So we see this kind of incorporation of these states into the architecture of American empire more globally that really, if you like, undercuts the promise of this anti-colonial moment, this nationalization moment. And that's why we start to see tensions very clearly here between parts in the Middle East, parts of the Arab nationalists and other kinds of left-wing movements in the region against the Gulf monarchies because of their clear orientation towards US power at the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation or your lecture. I just had a question. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the preference that the U.S. had on supporting the monarchies in the region, right? If you could give a little bit of the historical context. I think you were talking about a lot of the Arab nationalism that perhaps had a different form. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's a great question. Yes. So one of the important thing to realize about these Gulf monarchies is that these are states where there is the labor force is predominantly non-citizen migrant workers. In fact, all of the 6 Gulf monarchies, more than half of the labor force are non-citizens. They're drawn from workers from South Asia, the wider Middle East region, as well as African continent and elsewhere. And so you see this very distinctive class structure on one side, which makes these monarchies different from places like Iran or Iraq, where you have quite militant labor movements as part of the bigger anti-colonial struggles that emerge and anti-imperialist struggles that emerge in later years. The other side to this is that these monarchies are heavily dependent upon the United States, particularly for military protection. So the US basically builds a very strong military umbrella, as we can see today, actually, in protecting these monarchies. And part of this is reinforced through the sale of American military hardware to the Gulf monarchies. So if we look, for example, at the global military trade, the largest consumers of military hardware, imports of military hardware globally, are the Gulf states. And the largest consumer of American military hardware globally is actually the Gulf states over the last 5 or 6 years. So this is, on one sense, it builds this kind of military alliance, but on the other hand, it's another way of recirculating petrodollar wealth into the US markets, because this is military hardware produced by, of course, American firms. So again, this tight link between militarism, oil, finance becomes very evident through these patterns. So I would say those are the overriding point here is, of course, that the Gulf monarchies are the world's largest exporters of oil and increasingly of gas as well. So their place in the global energy trade is absolutely essential because of this large export role they play.
All right. Thank you, Adam. I don't know if you can see it, but we got 4 people in queue. Maybe we can take the 4 questions together, and then you can address them collectively or pick and choose. Would that be okay?
Brilliant. Right. Absolutely.
Hi. My question is, how should anti-colonialist movements not fall into the trap of what Adrian called conditional decolonization, decolonization basically on the conditions of capitalist superpowers, especially when a lot of the roads to decolonization are dependent on capital?
Hi, I don't know what genre, if this is a theoretical or an empirical question, but what are the differences, if there are any, between the political economy of something like crude oil and something like palm oil? Thank you.
So my question's on labor. Fossil capital not only mobilized political movements in oil-producing nations, but also mobilized new regimes of labor, especially from so-called sending countries to service both direct production of petroleum, but also social reproduction like domestic work. There's the kafala system, et cetera. Can you talk about how, if at all, global South migrant labor struggles are intersecting with or synthesizing with Arab nationalisms and other social movements in the region?
Hi, Dr. Hanieh. This question was emailed into us, and the question is, I recently went to a talk where retired U.S. government officials insinuated that the Iran war was to protect U.S. global democracy. What are your thoughts on that? That's one to close on.
Okay, those are the questions? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so let me try to address those. The first question is a very important one around how to think about these kinds of anti-colonial struggles in relation to the bigger questions of capitalism. As I've tried to say in my lecture, I think we need to think about how the limits of the anti-colonial movements and the ways in which states like Saudi Arabia were very much incorporated into American empire through the 1970s and through till today. And I think the way to do that is to think about them we need to foreground the anti-capitalism these struggles. It's not enough simply to talk about sovereignty or national control of industry. In the Saudi Arabia, for instance, oil is completely nationalized, but that does not impact or challenge in any way the American empire. So we need to think about these, I think, as anti-capitalist, push them in anti-capitalist directions, but also think about them in the regional context. In the Middle East, of course, we see the ways in which the poorest territories and states in the region align directly alongside the wealthiest. So in, of course, the Gaza Strip, directly neighboring Israel, and the question of Yemen, directly neighboring Saudi Arabia. So these regional inequalities, so bound up with militarism and violence in the region, cannot be separated from this question of extraction and oil. So I think thinking about the regional picture is part of this. The next question on crude oil and palm oil. I mean, they're very different substances. I mean, they're both extracted and globally circulate. But the point about crude oil is that it's really remains the most important commodity in the world today, in the sense that it does not only exist in the form of petrol or gasoline and liquid fuels. All of the substances that are around you in your room and here in my office are essentially products of oil. If we're thinking about the clothes we wear, the plastics, the synthetic rubbers, the food we eat is dependent upon synthetic fertilizers and motorized transport. So all of these oil's presence is in some ways invisibilized in our lives because we think about it simply in the form of this liquid fuel, but it's bound up with the basis of material commodity production, is bound up with the making of our financial system. So we need to think about it in these expansive ways. Yes, the question of labor is absolutely again, a very important question. And I think I tried to draw the parallel here in the sense of, like, we look at what happened in the refining industries in Venezuela and the location outside of Venezuela of the major refineries that process Venezuelan oil in the 1930s. In contrast to, for instance, Iran, where the refinery was located inside Iran, and we saw it was the center of these huge labor strikes. Now, it's interesting to look historically at the ways in which the refining sector was one of the first sectors which was really moved very quickly towards some kind of highly mechanized, automated processes. So, we see the expulsion of labor from both the extraction of crude oil, but also the refining and the petrochemical sectors as well in later decades. So, this is, it's a question of thinking about these kind of labor regimes that exist in the oil sector. But that's not to say that there aren't other forms of labor that might be directly impactful, like transport and logistics of labor. But I think you mentioned the kafala system, and I think that's very important to think about in terms of the Gulf states, because as I said, half the labor force is made up of temporary migrant labor that have no viable route to citizenship or kind of permanent residency. They can be expelled at any moment if they engage in any kind of labor struggles, and unions are banned for migrant workers in these Gulf monarchies. So, the forms of labor control that underpin, the buildings and the skyscrapers and the petrochemical industries and all of the fantastical projects that we see on our TV screens are based upon migrant labor. And these are capitalism in the Gulf needs to be thought about in this kind of hierarchical structure, I think. And then finally, yes, the claims around Iran and U.S. global democracy. No, I don't think it's about spreading global democracy there. I do think it is an attempt to do what I described in the lecture about it's a further example of how the United States is attempting to reassert its primacy in the region. Israel, obviously, as it has been over the last 2 years, but stretching much further back, is the primary ally of American power in the region, but also the ways in which this is bound up with further linkages and normalization between the Gulf monarchies and Israel as kind of the next steps coming out of this, I think. There's a bigger story here which we don't have time to deal with, but it is important to consider the ways in which the oil trade has changed in the last 2 decades, and that oil in the region, in the Gulf monarchies, as well as Iran, as well as Iraq, no longer flow predominantly to Western markets. They flow to China and East Asia. And we can see the ways in which that itself, the ability to cut those oil supplies, is a big part, I think, of what the United States is thinking, or the Trump administration is thinking around the kind of bigger questions of the relative decline of American power. So I think that's the bigger picture, which unfortunately we don't have time to discuss in more detail. But thank you.
Okay, and if I could finish up with one last question. In the last pages of Crude Capitalism, you gestured toward eco-socialism. So can you talk a little bit?
Sorry, I can't. I can't quite hear that question.
Okay, so the last pages of Crude Capitalism, you gestured toward eco-socialism as a potential pathway forward. So can you talk a little bit about how you conceptualize eco-socialism?
Yes, thank you. So from what I hear, the question is about eco-socialism, how to conceptualize eco-socialism. Yeah. So yes, I end the book talking about this and basically trying to make the argument. It's not my argument. Others have made this as well, I think, in very clear terms, that when we're talking about confronting the climate emergency, we need to think about how do fossil fuels, and in particular, how does oil relate to the capitalism and the global capitalist system. And it's very clear that this is not a technical problem. It's not just about switching out one energy source for another, or changing, recycling more, or whatever it might be. It actually requires a fundamental change to the system, because oil's significance stems from what it does for capitalism, its place in capitalist social relations. And so I think this points to the fact that we need to have an anti-capitalist orientation to the question of the climate and dealing with the climate emergency. This is something, as I say in the book, it can't be confined to changes to energy systems in Europe or the United States, North America. It's a global question, and it's very much bound up with dealing with questions of access to resources, energy resources, but also food, dealing with those kinds of inequalities that exist at the global level. So that's the other kind of question that I bring into this, that it needs to be seen as part of a struggle against global inequalities, not simply an environmental question. And that, I think, is what should undergird, if you like, the eco-socialist perspective.
All right, thank you. Can we give a round of applause?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I know it's getting very late over there, so thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.